substance dualism, if you remember. And I haven't fixed this yet. But. So we were looking at the divisibility argument for substance dualism. So remember Descartes says that there's a difference here between the mind and the body, and that the body can be divided, the mind cannot. Therefore, they must be different things. And he justifies that through, subjective, and what's the term that he uses? Or that we used? Introspection. So turning the mind in on itself. You're introspecting on your own inner states. And what the problem of split brain patients suggested is that, well, perhaps introspection is not the best way to go. Right? So if you look at these split brain patients, these people have had the corpus callosum split. Well, when they introspect, it's not like they say, oh yeah, I can tell half of me is here and half of me is here. Right? To them, they still seem like a complete mind. And yet it does seem like we have divided the mind in some significant way. Right? Which isn't surprising, because the mind, whatever it is clearly tied to the brain somehow. Okay? There was another case of a split brain patient, kind of a tragic case, where if you know, half the brain is more rational, the other is more emotional. And so this poor guy would wake up every morning, and the rational side of his brain would be saying, I need to get ready for work, I need to go to work because I need to work to make money and support myself. And the emotional side of him was saying, no, I hate work, I want to stay in bed and sleep. And so he'd have to fight with himself every morning to get dressed. Half of his body, controlled by the rational side part of his brain, was trying to get him dressed, and the other part's fighting against him, try to get him undressed and back in bed. So that was kind of unfortunate. But anyway, so that's an objection to his argument. We now have to consider one of the big problems for substance dualism in general. And this comes from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. And Descartes and Elizabeth had a long correspondence between them. She was very philosophically astute. And after the Meditations was published, she wrote to him and said, I beseech you to tell me how the soul of man, since it is but a thinking substance, can determine the spirits of the body to produce voluntary actions. For it seems every determination of movement happens from an impulsion of the thing moved, according to the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else depends on the qualification and figure of the superficies. What the heck is that? That's got to be a typo. Maybe it's not. Superficies of this latter. Contact is required for the first two conditions, and extension for the third. You entirely exclude extension from your notion of the soul, and contact seems to be incompatible with an immaterial thing. So the worry is this. Remember that Descartes has said that a mind is a non-extended thing, whereas a body is extended, right? Takes up space, has all these physical properties. And what all this boils down to then is, well, if that's the way that the mind and body are, then how can they possibly have any causal interaction with one another? Because a mind is non-physical, it has no surface, it has no physical properties. So explain to us, Descartes, how this could possibly occur. Now, in the Meditations, Descartes talks about, if you look at the brain, there's a gland that's kind of buried deep in the brain. And it's interesting that he would know about this, right? I mean, scientists are going about acquiring these bodies, these dead bodies, kind of illegally, and studying anatomy and everything. Well, there's this gland in the brain called the pineal gland. And Descartes thought, well, maybe this is where the soul interacts with the body. Because it's right in the middle of the brain. It's right where you'd expect it to be. Because one thing that you need is a brain structure that brings in sense data from touch and sight and smell and everything else, and brings them all together. And so you'd expect it to be right in the middle of everything. And plus, they didn't know what else it did, so why not? Now, since then, we've learned that, in fact, the pineal gland produces a kind of hormone that regulates the size of the male gonads, which then opens up all sorts of possibilities for jokes about thinking, right, the way that men think, if that's the seat of the mind. But anyway, so obviously this isn't going to do, just try to solve this problem, because there's still the issue about how a mind can actually causally interact then with a physical gland, right? So he doesn't solve it in the Meditations. But Descartes writes back to Elizabeth, and he proposes a solution by drawing an analogy with heaviness. So he says, well, think about the heaviness of an object. Is heaviness extended? Does it have physical properties? Does it have a surface? Well, no. And yet, he says, it seems that the heaviness of the object is what pushes it down. So even though heaviness doesn't have any physical properties, it does seem to have a causal impact on physical objects. And the heaviness pervades the physical object and so on and so forth. So maybe the mind is like that. Even though the mind is not extended, it can still pervade the whole brain or body, whatever, and still have a causal influence on it. Now, of course, what's the problem with this?
It's a weak analogy because soul and heaviness.
Well, just ignoring the analogical part of it for a moment, is that what heaviness is? Is there heaviness in this that causes it to go down? No, I mean, what is heaviness? What does it mean to say that something's heavy?
Gravity has a...
Yeah, it has to do with the mass of the thing in a gravitational field, right? So, of course, Descartes' writing right at the beginning of the scientific revolution, so he didn't have a good understanding of heaviness and gravity and all this at the time. So, yeah, it's not going to work. So this remains then kind of the big sticking point for any sort of substance dualist account. If you're going to say that there's a soul or spirit or whatever that's non-material, and then you've got this material body, well then how do they interact with one another? And of course, Searle brings that up. Now, we'll get to Searle in a minute, but let me mention another philosopher of this period. His name is Nicolas Malebranche. You can't overstate the influence of Descartes' philosophy on the modern period, especially in France. And Malebranche was a French philosopher. He was a Cartesian. And he recognized this problem. I mean, he was aware of the correspondence and everything. And how can we make these interact? Well, here's the way that Malebranche conceived it. He said, all right, we've got the mind, right, and these mental states and events up here. And then here we've got the body and physical states and events down here. Now it's clear that physical events, physical states can cause one another, right? So you've got one billiard ball comes, hits a second billiard ball moves. Okay. So clearly you can have causal interaction between physical things. And he says it's not problematic to think about mental states and events causing one another. So maybe I feel hungry, right? So there's this feeling of hunger, that's a mental state. And that causes then a desire for a sandwich. So the feeling gives rise to a desire. And the desire gives rise to a willing to go to the fridge to get the sandwich. So the problem has to do with causal interaction between these. So Descartes wanted to say, yeah, you can have this kind of causal interaction. So I will my arm to go up, and that causes my arm to go up. So my arm goes up. And so what Princess Elizabeth is saying is, well, you've got to explain to us how that's possible. Question? You're squinting.
I just don't know
Which part? This?
that. Yeah.
Will my arm to go up? That's surprising. No one ever has trouble reading my handwriting. So she raises this problem, right? Is how does this sort of thing occur? And Malebranche comes along and says, yep, that does seem to be a big problem. So Malebranche does away with this causal interaction entirely. So I will my arm to go up, and then my arm goes up. But he says it wasn't my willing my arm to go up that did it. So you might be thinking, well, then that was a pretty nifty coincidence then, right? My alarm clock goes off and wakes me up. But he says, but it wasn't the physical sound, right, that caused me to wake up. So what did it then? I'll give you a hint. He was a Jesuit priest. So we've seen this before in the history of philosophy, right? You have a big problem that you can't solve, and you do what?
What do you got?
Plug in God, right? So his theory is something called occasionalism. And the idea here is that mental or physical events are simply the occasion for God to cause the corresponding physical or mental event. So notice how these have been switched, right? Went from mental to physical to physical mental. So I will my arm to go up. My willing then is the occasion for God to actually raise my arm. So God's like the conduit between the mental and the physical. So God's pretty busy, right, on this account. Now, can you anticipate any problems with this? Yeah.
It's really easy to say God's not wholly good because there's a lot of evil actions that are physical.
Yeah, so this is one of the problems. You can imagine going into a courtroom, right, and pleading and saying, well, I didn't stab the guy. I only willed it. But you can't prosecute me for my willings. God actually did it, so just because I willed it, I'm kind of mad at God because I willed it to happen and he did it. And, geez, prosecute him. So exactly right. That's one problem. But is there another problem here? Yeah.
Elizabeth takes away your free will at times.
How so?
Kind of like God, like the same thing in the court case. God made me do it, so you don't really have control of yourself.
Well, obviously God is allowing you to do an awful lot of stuff here, right? So you're still willing stuff, and God is playing along. And, okay. So your free will is still there in a sense. You're still doing all this stuff. God's not causing you to will the things that you do. So we've got God here, right in the middle. So the willing obviously goes and God perceives that, and then God does this. And then something down here happens that God's aware of, and then God causes this. Well, think about this. What kind of being is God? Well, there's at least 4 choices I can think of. Suppose God is entirely material. If God is entirely material, then you've got the problem of causal interaction here. If God is entirely immaterial, like a mind, then you've got the problem of causal interaction down here. If God is both material and immaterial, then you've got the problem of causal interaction in God's mind. And 4th option, God is nothing like us, a whole different kind of being, in which case you haven't explained anything at all. Because now the mystery is pushed off onto God. So you've got both theological and philosophical objections to this. The theological one is that it turns God into a murderer in some sense. The philosophical one is that it just, you've got the same problem, right? You haven't explained anything by just plugging God in.
So explain the last one again.
If God is, right, mysterious, if God is nothing like us,
Right.
then all that you've done is plugged a mystery in as part of an explanation. It's the same problem that we had when we were talking about the design argument. And if God is nothing like us, then how can we explain this being creating the world, right? How is that any more explanatory than the world being self-creating? You're just replacing a mystery with a mystery. Okay, so because of this problem, the problem of causal interaction, substance dualism isn't a very popular position anymore among philosophers. There's one, I think I can get rid of this. Nope, I gotta do one more thing before I get rid of this. Export, oh no, there's a big grades, can't do that, sorry. Gonna have to do that later. You're recording, aren't you?
No, it's actually not at the screen.
What's that?
It's not facing
Oh,
the
it's just,
screen.
okay, good. I was in trouble. There's one exception to this. There's a contemporary philosopher by the name of David Chalmers. And he's an Australian, originally from Australia. Now he's, I think he's at Arizona State. Not Arizona State, University of Arizona. But he might have moved recently. Anyway, he argues for substance dualism by using the example of zombies. Okay? So zombies are all the rage nowadays, right? Well, Chalmers anticipated all this. He came out with a book a number of years ago that antedated all this stuff about zombies, and he argued that, well, the logical possibility of zombies actually shows that the mind is a distinct thing from the body. But nobody really buys that argument, so we won't worry about it. I just mentioned it to you. But philosophers like to talk about zombies too. It's all Chalmers' fault. Okay, so if we're not going to be substance dualists, then what are some of the alternatives? we don't have time to go through all of the alternatives in here. In fact, we're in process right now of creating a course on philosophy of mind that Dr. Green will be teaching. He's taught it before as an experimental course. So if you're interested, look for that in the next year or two. We're just going to talk about other types of dualism. So I've given you this reading from Searle. And he is an interesting kind of dualism. He'd be really mad at me for doing this. But I'm going to label him a kind of property dualist. Now he'd be mad at me because he actually had a paper come out in 2002, 2005, somewhere in there, that says, "Why I'm not a property dualist." He had to write this paper because everybody thinks he's a property dualist, and it's his own darn fault because, boy, he seems like a property dualist. So we're just going to treat him as a property dualist. Now, to get into this, what is the mind-body problem? I mean, why does he think that we are stuck with this problem? I mean, for him, what does it come down to? Remember, we've jumped ahead several centuries from Descartes to Searle. Searle's a contemporary philosopher. And why does he think that the mind-body problem is still a problem for us? Yeah.
Because the concept of the mind conflicts with like the physical properties of science.
Yeah, good. So we've got the scientific conception of the world that tells us that the world is made up of material things. So how do we reconcile that with the concept of the mind? So how does the concept of mind fit in with our scientific view of the world? So science tells us that the world is material. But then we have this bothersome non-material part of it, so we see this part that has mind. Now, as he notes, there are 4 features of the mind that are particularly hard to account for in a material world. And what are they? What's the first one? Page 15, what does he say? Consciousness, yeah, good. So, we look at the second full paragraph from the bottom on page 15, or second full paragraph on page 15. It says, there are 4 features of mental phenomena which have made them seem impossible to fit into our scientific conception of the world as made up of material things. And it is these 4 features that have made the mind-body problem really difficult. They are so embarrassing that they have led many thinkers in philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence to say strange and implausible things about the mind. Now, the most important of these features is consciousness. So we also, sorry. I at this moment of writing this, and you at the moment of reading it, are both conscious. It is just a plain fact about the world that it contains such conscious mental states and events. So this idea, when we talk about consciousness, that there's this kind of awareness going on. I mean, that's a really mysterious thing about the world, right? If we're not going to accept the existence of an immaterial mind or soul or spirit or whatever you want to call it, then isn't it really strange that this material thing in your head, this brain, this gray matter, can actually be conscious? How do we explain that? It's truly a mysterious thing. Now, of course, when we talk about the idea of artificial intelligence, if you remember the PowerPoint on personal identity, we asked this question about whether Mr. Data from Star Trek, can he be a person? And of course, a lot of what that turns on, a lot of what that question turns on, is whether Mr. Data can be conscious. Right? So suppose that we have this artificial thing, right, this robot, that is able to take in information from the world, it's able to perceive things in a sense, and you build it so that it can process it, and then you have this output. Is that sufficient for consciousness? Or is consciousness something that is strictly restricted to organic beings?
Isn't that like Dennett's whole thing? The Hubert?
Yeah. So, you know, Hubert presumably instantiates his mind in some way, but can it really be conscious? Now, notice that we're dealing with two slightly different problems here. So, if we've got memories and everything built into Hubert, but it's not conscious, can it still be a person? Here we're asking, well, is it even a mind? Right? So is Hubert even really possible? When we were discussing Dennett, we were just assuming that Hubert could exist, right? Which we do as a thought experiment, right? Suppose that this computer really does have consciousness, then is that you? Now we're going to the problem, but can it be conscious? Okay, that's a different issue. Yeah?
So we're just trying to declare that whether or not artificial intelligence can be conscious,
right?
Not whether or not it's human, just if it's artificial.
That's right. That's right. So that's one of the big problems in artificial intelligence, or one of the big questions in artificial intelligence, right? Suppose you have a computer or a robot that can mimic everything that human beings do. Is there consciousness there? Is that possible? And there's a great Star Trek episode. Anybody who has, I think I already mentioned this in here. Anybody who has Netflix, there's a Star Trek episode from The Next Generation. I think it's in the first or second season called The Measure of a Man. And it deals with this. Okay, so consciousness, that's a big problem. What's the second one?
Intentionality.
Intentionality. So what does that mean, intentionality? It doesn't have to do with having intentions.
The ability to refer to something or to be about something.
Yeah, good. So the ability to refer to or be about something. That's kind of a mysterious thing, right? So suppose that we have a dog out here, and then there's this person, right? And in their mind, they're thinking about the dog. So the thought is about or refers to the dog. That's intentionality. Well, how can something that's in here, inside the skull, be about something that's out there, right? There's this interesting connection between the mind and the world. Okay, so that's something that needs to be considered. Third mysterious thing, subjectivity. And what does that mean? Yeah, so this has to do with, each of us has a certain point of view. So each one of us perceives the world from a slightly different standpoint. And that's kind of an interesting thing about the world. And then the fourth mystery, something we've just been talking about, mental causation. Yeah. So the Princess Elizabeth problem, right? So how can anything mental cause anything physical to happen? Now we're almost out of time, so let's just mention Searle's two-part solution. He has two theses going on here. And what's the first thesis that he mentions? Right, good. So on page 18, he says that mental phenomena are caused by processes going on in the brain. And then secondly, page 19,
Pain's another mental phenomenon or just features of the brain.
yeah, so mental phenomena are just features of the brain. Or as he puts it over on page 26, consciousness is a real property of the brain that can cause things to happen. Oh, consciousness is a property of our brain? No wonder everybody calls him a property dualist and then objects to that, right? Okay, so on Monday we'll talk about how these work together. Maybe bring up a few objections, finish that up. And then we'll get into our next topic, which is what are our obligations to